Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And today I'm going to be recreating this screenshot from the 1991 Samurai Pizza Cats video game, based on the cartoon series of the same name, or more specifically I should be saying it's based on the original Japanese version known as Kyatto Ninden Teyandee, which was eventually dubbed and altered to yield the series known as Samurai Pizza Cats. But either way, I've always had a soft spot for this series, both versions, and the game is a really solid platformer as well. So I thought it'd be fun to explore what a redesign might look like. That being said, I still want the DNA of the original visuals to be felt, so I'm going to work with the same canvas size, but not be so concerned with things like color limits on sprites and tile counts. To get started, I've gone through a few screenshots from the game and pulled a representative color palette to use in my work as well. By sticking to the same colors, I hope to maintain the overall tone of the original, and the way I'll increase the level of fidelity is by using as many of these colors as I like within the individual sprites and tiling. The first thing I decided to do was explore the look of the sprite for Yattaro, otherwise known as Speedy in the American version. One of my objectives with this redraw is to attempt a stronger resemblance to the cartoon. Not that the original game was so abstract by any means, but what I'm doing for the character here is that I'm only focusing on the head design for now, and not worrying about the remainder of the sprite design quite yet. Basically, I just want to figure out how much space I need in order to capture an accurate look for the face, and then the body can be made with that remaining space. Ideally, I'd like to stay within the 32 pixel height of the original sprite, but even so you can see that I'm already allocating a larger percentage of that total space to the head, and that's helping squeeze a bit more recognizability into the sprite. My main points of reference here were translating and retaining key shapes like the circles on the front and side of the helmet, and then finding the right configuration of the face within there too, obviously. And using multiple colors here really helps to break that up rather than relying solely on line work to do that, and can actually save a bit of space compared to a pure line work approach as well. Once the head's in a good spot, I continue on with the rest of the design by laying down a simple stick figure base for the body. In bulking up the stick figure to create the character silhouette, I'm comparing against the reference images there to consider the placement of each armor panel and segment. One of the things that's great about his design are all these little recognizable features, like there's the collar with the rescue bell, under that there's a little triangle, and then under that there's a small belt too. Now, when it comes to the pixel art, this becomes really tough to fit all these elements within what ends up being about only 4 pixels of height on the body. So I kept working things around to explore the possibilities. And again here, the thing that really helps is not carrying on the line work too much in these spots. In fact, the main way that I've decided to use the additional colors at my disposal is by adding them just to color block out different costume details like this, rather than trying to use those colors to make fancy shading within the costume. I think this solid color block look maintains a lot of the logic and style of the original sprite, but then obviously because we've got more colors overall, there's more retention of that costume design from the cartoon. It was nice to get the character sprite finished first, just as a sort of proof of concept in testing the kind of stylistic changes that are possible with the redraw. And so now it's time to do basically everything else, no big deal, just the entire rest of the illustration here. So what I'm doing is blocking out the level design based on the screenshot, using this 8x8 grid to kind of section things out, like the areas for the HUD, the ground, and then the large building on the right side of the screen. This building is going to be the next thing that I do since it's really the largest set piece, and also another area where I feel like there's a lot of visual language that can be brought in from the cartoon. I've gathered a few screen caps from the series for inspiration, and just like with the original game, I'm working on having things adhere to the 8x8 grid, but one of the biggest differences is that I'm actually having the roof taper off at an angle here rather than having flat edges. One of the challenges when doing a remake or sort of remaster type of approach is just in deciding a suitable rendering style to use. As I mentioned with the character sprite, I like this idea of doing something that retains a sort of simplistic feel like the original NES graphics, but obviously we want to introduce some new kind of elements to make it worth revisiting in this way. So for the building, I've tried to follow the same original color scheme, like with the white walls and the red roof, so that we obviously recognize it as being the same place. But then I've added additional finishing like the pale blue drop shadow, which is inspired by the cartoon look. Another portion that's quite similar is the interior detailing, where there's a few shades of gray used to pop out a few details from the shadows. I don't know why exactly, but I really love that look and just kind of freestyled my own interpretation of it. You probably wouldn't even know when taking in the piece as a whole, but it was honestly one of my favorite things about making this entire piece. Just a small little thing like that does it sometimes, In tying the whole thing together, I've pulled in this idea of the wall banner with the cat paw logo, and that comes directly from the cartoon screen cap. I like that it gives a bit more identity to the building, and now it's made it into something that can be recognized from the show too, so that's kind of cool. The last bit of detailing is something that's really important in my opinion when you're tackling Samurai Pizza Cat's architecture, and that's the little sci-fi details on the buildings. Often you'll see stuff like satellite dishes and paneling on the walls, vents and lights and all this sort of stuff. And these collectively provide that bit of twist on otherwise traditional looking buildings. I guess another subtle thing too are those vertical windows. And again, a lot of these additions to my pixel work are just sort of an amalgamation of details from across the reference images. Moving on from here, the rest of the street level detailing on the original screenshot is really just some trees. So I started to look for other cartoon elements to bring in addition to that foliage. And I found this awesome looking gate, again with a little cat paw in the front too. So I'm going to build that up and then have the foliage sit behind and around that. I made this one as a head-on view just like the building, and used the character sprite as a guide for deciding how large it should be. Going along from there is some repeating tiling for a little wall just like we see in the reference image. Okay, so the thing with this one was that it started out with this stripe pattern, and that seemed okay when looking at it on its own. But with the character sprite in there, it's just way too much bold line work to have behind them, and you start to lose the read on the character sprite. So instead I opted to simplify this into a plain wall that won't cause this kind of interference. And in the end, there's enough going on elsewhere that it's kind of nice to have a plain element like this anyway. And it's kind of a similar story for the foliage actually. I kept things pretty simple here because I noticed that's kind of how the cartoon is. There's sort of some line work for the outer silhouette, and then a few points where it breaks in a little bit. And the whole thing is shaded with a few steps of green tones. At least that's how it is for things in that one reference image that I put my entire faith in. But I like the way that this semi-freeform approach came together for this one, since it breaks out around a lot of things that already have a bit more of a rigid structure in their pixel work. Speaking of which, moving along to the pathway here, I'm going to do this section as a repeated tile. I'm using a space of 24 by 24 pixels to rough out an initial design, and then this will be copied out to fill that entire area. I usually like to copy out small bits of it as I'm designing, just to get a feel for how everything is connecting at that repeat point. I've done just a really subtle amount of rendering here, like there's a little shadow in darker gray on one side and then a small highlight near the other corner. Also, I've split the design into kind of a top half, bottom half approach, where the lower area primarily uses the darker gray. I wasn't doing this for shading purposes, although that could be a reason. I was actually doing this so that it works as a sort of gradient, as if the presence of the rocks is gradually fading away, leading down to frame the HUD that'll be there. Up in the sky, we arrive at one of the things I was most looking forward to with this redraw. In the original screenshot, the background has this tiled approach for a bunch of buildings filling that area, and then a few featured ones protruding from the horizon. I think the goal with this sort of look is capturing that wide establishing shot like you see in the show. And in fact, that same shot actually does appear in the game as well, in the form of the stage selection screen. What I want to do is take that wide perspective shot and use it as the backdrop in the level design itself. So to get this started, I've translated that castle into a style that's reminiscent of the in-game design, which uses that light blue and black to create a bit of dimension against the sky. From here, I'm radiating out a bunch of straight lines from the castle by clicking while holding Shift. And I'm doing this sort of randomly, just choosing a few spaced out locations for new lines. And this is generating a one-point perspective framework that I can use to create the feel of depth across the city. Buildings closer to us will appear larger, and those further away will only be a few pixels. And I'm just following those grid lines to get that gradual tapering as various buildings cover that distance. Once I started to shade more of this work with the black, it started looking a bit heavy against the other work that I've done in the foreground, and so I decided to swap out all that black shading for a vibrant blue instead. And this still has a lot of presence as far as providing noticeable shading contrast, but it's softer when you're trying to take in the entire illustration, and I think it just works out way better for the rendering style of this redraw. Another detail for the backdrop are some clouds. The cartoon uses these like simple, almost flat shapes, while the game has kind of more elaborate swirly designs, which are also a really nice touch. So I kind of went for something in between these two. I wanted to make sure to pay enough homage to the swirl though, so it's maybe got a bit more of that character to it. Another thing that's kind of tough about a redraw, I guess, is that there are things that are in the original that, once I get in there, I'm like, oh, that's great. I kind of actually wouldn't want to redo too much about that. Like, it looks good as is. The strongest of that feeling for this redraw was probably with the HUD design. I already love the look. Like, we've already got a clean design here. There's that contrasting appearance of the power bar and then the help bar with the gradations on it. So what I decided to do here was just start recreating these pieces as they are, and along the way just looking for opportunities for improvement or change while I was actually drawing them out. One of the things that came to mind during this was that I could use a different lettering for the text. Rather than kind of a standard pixel lettering, I tried to give it more of a brushstroke inspired design. I've also changed the word help to rescue, since the purpose of this function in-game is to call in backup from the rescue team. Like, that's what they're actually called kind of in the context of the show. So it seemed fitting enough to just change that name to rescue instead. Lastly, I thought it helped to introduce some color coding to the various icons and bars here instead of having everything in kind of the red color. The Ninpo meter refers to the amount of charge on the power-ups that you have equipped, and I've changed that to blue along with the icons that refer to the assigned ability. And then for the rescue meter, I've gone with a yellow accent color, and then I've given kind of a slight restyling to that meter itself. And finally, the last finishing touch on the redraw here is going to be to add in a couple enemies. The screenshot that I chose to redraw is actually sort of the first frame of the level, so there are no enemies or anything in frame yet, but I just actually really particularly like that framing for everything and sort of felt the potential of it, So I'm going to shoehorn in a few enemies just for the full effect, obviously. As you can see, I've copied over my character sprite and done some editing to that to create the Ninja Crow here. And even though I've played through the game, I was actually still surprised to see how the original Ninja Crow was as small as it was when actually sitting down to compare the sprite work here. I decided to make my version similar in height to the player, as I'm pretty sure they are in the cartoon as well. So mainly this extra allowance of height means there's a lot more room to capture a more accurate likeness. And, plus the higher color count really helps with that as well. Similarly, I'm now taking that design and editing it into a sprite for Karamaru, otherwise known as Bad Bird in the American version, who is the leader of the Ninja Crows, and in the show he's kind of a common frontline enemy for the Pizza Cats, often leading the charge and quite commonly appears like perched up on a roof or something, making a stance there. So I thought he'd just be a fun addition, as a reference to the cartoon. He's in the game also, which is the comparison sprite here. But, since this is the first sort of generic city level, it makes enough sense that we might see him for a brief moment at the start. Anyway, with that, let's finally go ahead and take a look at the finished design. Here we go. Alright, so I just wanted to point out that I've kind of doctored the original screenshot here to also include the enemies. We've seen that original screenshot a few times already, and I just wanted to include the sprite work of all characters for the full effect of this comparison. A couple subtle finishing touches here are that I've added some confetti to the sky. This is actually a reference to the title sequence of the show. And then the other thing is that I tried to squeeze in some representation of the Pizza Cat's pizza parlor. And the top of this building raises up and reveals a giant revolver that they fire out of to go on to missions, naturally. And so, here it's incredibly abstract with this pixel art, but I just wanted to point out that it is there. And let's go ahead and close out with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.